The courtroom was still. The sound of shuffling papers and muted whispers faded as all eyes turned toward one figure, Representative Jasmine Crockett. She wasn't the judge. She wasn't even the attorney of record. But at that moment, she commanded the entire room. Judge Aileen Cannon, known for her composure and her sharp judicial demeanor, leaned forward from the bench. No one quite expected what came next. Crockett, armed with meticulous legal precision, was about to challenge a premise so fundamentally flawed that the courtroom itself seemed to hold its breath. This wasn't a routine exchange. It wasn't just another day in court. It was a test of law, logic, and the limits of how far confidence could stretch before it snapped against the wall of fact. And when it did snap, it was loud. For months, headlines had painted Judge Aileen Cannon as a key player in one of the most closely watched judicial sagas in modern American history. Critics accused her of bias, supporters defended her impartiality, and the legal community watched closely as her rulings shaped the narrative around some of the most controversial federal cases in decades. Then, in the midst of that media storm, Jasmine Crockett entered the conversation not as a pundit, but as a practitioner of law who refused to be intimidated by titles or tradition. Crockett wasn't there to grandstand. She was there to question, to dissect, and to remind everyone, judge, counsel, and audience alike, that the law is not a performance, it's a discipline, it's structure, it's truth, wrapped in precedent and powered by evidence. So when Judge Cannon challenged Crockett's interpretation of due process and procedural fairness, what began as a tense back and forth turned into something electric. A bold legal move, calculated, methodical, and devastatingly effective, would soon stop the entire proceeding. Cold Judge Aileen Cannon represented the system, years of experience, duty, seal authority, and the weight of federal power. Jasmine Crockett represented something more unpredictable: sharp intellect, moral conviction, and the willingness to challenge the very system she respected. It wasn't arrogance versus arrogance. It was power versus precision. As Crockett laid out her argument, what seemed at first like an impossible uphill battle began to shift. She wasn't simply citing law. She was teaching it, weaving constitutional grounding with real-world application in a way that drew even her critics to attention. Her style was deliberate but unyielding. Every word carried weight, every pause was intentional. And then came the turn, the moment that would make national headlines. In the minutes ahead, you'll see how Crockett transformed a confrontation into a masterclass. You'll see how one well-prepared mind can turn a seemingly impossible situation into a defining legal moment. You'll see why Judge Cannon, known for her poise and authority, was caught visibly off guard, and how the courtroom's silence afterward wasn't just about shock, it was about respect. Because this wasn't about ego. It was about the law doing what it's supposed to do. Stand taller than anyone in the room, beyond the personalities, beyond the politics. This moment represents a fundamental question for every democracy. What happens when facts meet unchecked power? It's a story that echoes far beyond one courthouse. It's the kind of story that reminds us why truth still matters in an age of noise. Why legal literacy isn't just for lawyers, but for every citizen who wants to understand the mechanisms that protect their freedom. When people like Jasmine Crockett step into the arena armed with facts, they remind us that real justice doesn't need to shout. It just needs to stand firm. By the end of this story, you'll understand exactly what Jasmine Crockett did that stopped Judge Aileen Cannon and the entire courtroom in their tracks. Why her strategy wasn't just bold, but brilliantly calculated within the framework of law. And why this one exchange could shift how public officials handle confrontations grounded in both fact and principle. Because as the saying goes, in a world full of confident fiction, it only takes one person with facts to change everything. Stay tuned. The tension's only getting started. Before the confrontation that would stop the courtroom in its tracks. The air was already thick with tension. The legal stage had been set over weeks of heated exchanges, cryptic filings, and whispered speculations from the legal community. Everyone knew something was coming, but no one expected how it would unfold. It began with a motion simple in form, explosive in consequence. In the lead-up to the confrontation, Judge Aileen Cannon had found herself presiding over a case steeped in controversy and political weight. Legal analysts debated her every move. News networks parsed her rulings like sacred text. Some praised her as a stickler for due process. Others accused her of tilting the scales toward one side of the political aisle. That's when Representative Jasmine Crockett, an attorney, before she was ever a lawmaker, entered the picture. Known for her razor-sharp questioning during congressional hearings and her no-nonsense grasp of constitutional law, Crockett had developed a reputation for exposing contradictions others overlooked. So when she filed an amicus brief challenging one of Cannon's procedural interpretations, it wasn't just a legal move. It was a statement. To some it seemed audacious. To others it was long overdue. Crockett's submission questioned whether Cannon's handling of evidentiary discretion respected the spirit of due process. Her arguments were surgical, drawing from precedent cases, ethical standards, and even prior statements by Cannon herself. It was the kind of move that made the room go quiet, not because it was disrespectful, but because it was brilliantly precise. Jasmine Crockett's dual identity as both a congresswoman and a licensed attorney made her a unique player in this unfolding drama. Her training in criminal defense and civil rights law had always shaped her political voice, but this moment blurred the line between law and leadership, like never before. Judge Cannon, on the other hand, represented the judiciary, an institution built on structure, hierarchy, and the expectation that those who step into the courtroom respect its authority. So when Crockett's challenge came forward, many saw it as an implicit test. Could a sitting member of Congress, especially one who understood the law as deeply as she did, question the integrity of a federal judge's interpretation without crossing a line? That question alone stirred the media pot. Cable panels debated it. Law professors weighed in. Even former federal prosecutors speculated on how Cannon might respond. The heart of the conflict lay in a procedural dispute, something only legal scholars and courtroom veterans might fully appreciate. But to Crockett, it was more than semantics. It was about whether justice was being served or sidestepped. Crockett had noticed an irregularity, a selective acceptance of evidence that in her view skewed the case's narrative. It wasn't an outright violation of the law, but it nudged close enough to warrant scrutiny. Her brief laid it out clearly. If courts begin bending the rules of admissibility to favor one side, they risk eroding the very principle that makes the judicial system credible: fairness. That single word carried immense power. Fairness is the cornerstone of every courtroom, from small claims to the Supreme Court, and Crockett was about to argue that the foundation itself was cracking. Outside the courtroom, the tension reached a fever pitch. Political pundits were divided. Some labeled Crockett's intervention as grandstanding. Others called it the kind of courage the system needs. But inside the legal world, it was something different. A rare moment where two women from opposite sides of the institutional divide were about to collide in full public view. Judge Cannon, appointed by a former president and frequently scrutinized for perceived political bias, was known for her disciplined demeanor. She rarely raised her voice, rarely showed irritation. Crockett, by contrast, was known for passion and precision, a blend of legal intellect and fiery conviction that made her impossible to dismiss. The prospect of these two figures meeting in direct legal exchange wasn't just newsworthy, it was inevitable drama. In the days before the hearing, subtle signals began to emerge. Court filings hinted that Judge Cannon had taken particular notice of Crockett's brief. Her clerks began preparing detailed analyses of its claims. Meanwhile, Crockett's office, tight-lipped as ever, confirmed only that the Congresswoman stands by her submission. Behind the scenes, tension simmered. Was this a battle of egos or ideologies? Was it about respect, power, or principle? The truth was simpler. It was about the rule of law. Crockett's decision to appear personally in court, an unusual move for a sitting member of Congress, only heightened the anticipation. Commentators speculated she might use the appearance to send a message about judicial accountability. Others assumed she would back down under pressure. Neither side was ready for what actually happened. On the morning of the hearing, the courthouse buzzed with an energy rarely felt in federal proceedings. Security was tighter, reporters packed the hallway. Even seasoned court staff whispered about the moment. When Jasmine Crockett entered, dressed in her signature tailored navy suit, she moved with a quiet confidence. She carried a slim binder, no entourage, no theatrics. Across the room, Judge Cannon reviewed the docket with her usual calm, but her tone carried an undercurrent, measured, watchful, almost expectant. The gallery sensed it too. Something was about to happen. Crockett's motion hadn't come from nowhere. It was the culmination of X of decisions that, in her view, undermined transparency in the proceedings. Each step, each small ruling that appeared innocuous, had built a pattern. Selective exclusion of evidence, restrictive timelines that favored one party, a dismissive tone toward procedural objections. To the average observer, these were technicalities. To someone like Crockett, trained to see the invisible threads of power in legal processes, they painted a clear picture, a quiet imbalance tipping the scales of justice. So when she finally stood to argue, it wasn't about winning points or scoring sound bites. It was about setting the record straight, literally and legally. By the time the arguments began, every tension line had been drawn. Judge Cannon sat poised, ready to reaffirm her authority. Crockett stood at the table, prepared to dismantle the logic she saw as flawed. What neither expected was that the exchange would grow beyond legal sparring. It would become the moment everyone would remember. Because what Crockett revealed wasn't just a counter-argument, it was evidence, hard, undeniable procedural proof that shifted the entire conversation. Her move would challenge not only Cannon's reasoning, but the very assumptions underpinning the case. And when it happened, when Crockett made her bold strategic reveal, the courtroom didn't just pause, it froze. Every head turned. Every voice went silent. Even Judge Aileen Cannon, composed as ever, stopped mid-sentence. The air cracked with a kind of astonished respect. Something irreversible had just happened, and that's where we pick up next, the moment. Jasmine Crockett makes her boldest legal stand yet, a move so sharp and grounded in fact that even the judge known for control couldn't mask her surprise. The confrontation was coming, and this time it wouldn't be quiet. The hum of quiet conversation faded as the courtroom doors shut. It was the kind of silence that comes just before something. Hing. Unforgettable Jasmine Crockett stood at the plaintiff's table, her binder open, her eyes locked forward, not with defiance but with focus. Across from her, Judge Aileen Cannon presided with the calm authority of her position, her expression a careful blend of professionalism and poise. But beneath that calm there was tension, a current of unspoken challenge that everyone in the room could feel. Ms. Crockett. Judge Cannon began her tone. Even you've filed an amicus brief that questions this court's prior interpretation of evidentiary discretion. I trust you're prepared to clarify your position. Crockett didn't hesitate. Absolutely, Your Honor, she replied, voice steady. My brief raises one fundamental concern: whether this court, in its pursuit of procedural efficiency, has inadvertently compromised the principle of equal access to justice. A few murmurs rippled through the gallery. Crockett's choice of words, inadvertently compromised, was surgical, not accusatory, but unmistakably critical. Judge Cannon leaned back, assessing. That's a strong statement, Congresswoman. Are you implying that this court has acted with bias? Crockett met her gaze. I'm implying, Your Honor, that perception is as critical as intent. The appearance of fairness is the foundation of trust in the judiciary, and right now many Americans watching this case question whether that foundation is holding. It wasn't just a response, it was a mirror. Crockett had taken the judge's own language from a previous ruling, the appearance of fairness must be preserved, and turned it back toward her. The reporters in the back began scribbling furiously. Court staff tried not to look at one another. Even the clerks, normally stoic, stopped typing for a moment. Judge Cannon shifted slightly, folding her hands. Congresswoman Crockett, you're not here as a legislator, you're here as counsel to this motion. I would caution you to keep your statements confined to the legal merits of your argument. Of course, Your Honor, Crockett replied, her tone respectful but unwavering. And that's exactly where I'd like to begin, she flicked. Peed open her binder. If I may direct the court to Exhibit C, specifically the procedural record dated March 12th. You'll note that a key evidentiary filing from the defense was admitted without objection, despite lacking the certification typically required under Rule 90211. Cannon raised an eyebrow. I'm aware of that filing. Then you'll also recall, Crockett continued, that an identical filing from the opposing party was denied on that same basis. The discrepancy wasn't explained on the record. That's what brings us here today. You could almost feel the air leave the room. It wasn't a dramatic revelation, it was a factual one, and that made it far more dangerous. Judge Cannon adjusted her glasses, clearly aware of the gravity of what was being said. You're suggesting this court applied inconsistent standards. I'm not suggesting, Your Honor, Crockett said softly. I'm documenting. A pause. That line, I'm documenting, hit like a precision strike. Judge Cannon's tone cooled. This court operates under full transparency. Ms. Crockett. Every decision is subject to appeal or review, and that's exactly why transparency matters. Your Honor, Crockett said, because when inconsistencies appear, whether intentional or not, they invite scrutiny not only from the parties involved, but from the public who depends on this system to function without favor. Crockett then did something no one expected. Your Honor, she said, reaching into her binder again, I'd like to submit an addendum evidence recently obtained through a Freedom of Information Act request that directly relates to the March 12th discrepancy. Judge Cannon's head lifted slightly. On what grounds? On the grounds. Crockett said that the communication contained in this record shows informal correspondence between a clerk of this court and a member of the defense counsel's team prior to the admission of that uncertified filing. The gallery erupted in whispers. Cannon raised, her hand commanding silence. You're walking a very fine line, Congresswoman. Crockett nodded. I'm aware, Your Honor, but the line exists to be protected, not ignored. Crockett handed the sealed envelope to the bailiff who brought it to the bench. The judge opened it, eyes scanning the printed emails inside. The shift in her expression was small but unmistakable. Shock, then composure. You obtained these through a FOIA request. Yes, Your Honor, fully redacted and legally processed. Cannon exhaled slowly. The courtroom was utterly still. No one breathed. No one dared move. Crockett continued, breaking the silence. My point is not to accuse this court of impropriety, but to demonstrate that the perception of unequal treatment can become a matter of record when communication outside official procedure occurs. The public loses confidence not because of one action, but because of the appearance of imbalance. Her words landed like thunder, calm, reasoned. Devastating. Judge Cannon took off her glasses and set them on the bench. For the first time that day, she seemed unsure of what to say. Congresswoman Crockett, she finally said, I'll need to review this submission in chambers before determining admissibility. The court will recess for 15 minutes. But no one left. No one even stood. It was clear something irreversible had just happened. Reporters scrambled out into the hallway, phones in hand, while legal analysts tried to piece together what Crockett had just revealed. The emails weren't evidence of corruption, but they raised serious procedural questions, and more importantly, they revealed something deeper that Crockett had anticipated. This very confrontation, she hadn't come to react. She had come prepared. Her team had spent weeks quietly gathering documentation, tracking case timelines, and cross-referencing filings. Every move had been deliberate. To the public, it was a bombshell. To those who understood the law, it was strategy. When the court reconvened, Judge Cannon's demeanor had shifted. Her voice, still steady, carried an undertone of caution. Congresswoman Crockett, she said, this court has reviewed the material you presented. While it does not indicate misconduct, it does raise valid procedural questions that will be addressed through an independent review. Crockett nodded respectfully. That's all I ask, Your Honor. For a long moment, the two women simply looked at each other. Judge and lawmaker authority and accountability, both bound by the same system they served. And though Cannon maintained her composure, the balance of power in that courtroom had subtly changed. Legal Twitter exploded. Within minutes, hashtags like Crockett vs. Cannon and courtroom shock trended nationwide. Analysts replayed the footage, dissecting every pause, every line, every reaction. Commentators called it a masterclass in legal precision and a reminder of what real advocacy looks like. Even those who disagreed with Crockett's politics couldn't deny the clarity of her presentation. She hadn't attacked, she had proven, and that made her unshakable. In the days that followed, Cannon issued an official memorandum acknowledging the procedural irregularity Crockett had exposed and directing an administrative review of internal communication standards. It wasn't an admission of guilt, but it was a rare concession. For a judge known for decisiveness, that memo represented something profound, acknowledgement that even the highest seats of authority are not beyond examination. The confrontation between Jasmine Crockett and Judge Aileen Cannon wasn't just a courtroom skirmish. It became a defining moment in the intersection of law, power, and accountability. Crockett had demonstrated what happens when preparation meets principle. When someone walks into a system built on hierarchy and says, I respect this institution, but respect doesn't mean silence. Her final words that day summed it up perfectly. Your Honor, she said before leaving the courtroom, the strength of our justice system isn't found in who it protects, but in how it corrects. The judge nodded slowly, almost thoughtfully, and just like that the hearing ended. Not with a bang, but with a silence so heavy it spoke volumes. What followed in the hours after would ripple far beyond that courtroom. Media coverage erupted, public opinion split, and legal experts began dissecting every frame of that unforgettable exchange. The aftermath wasn't just reaction, it was reckoning. When Jasmine Crockett walked out of that courtroom, she wasn't just another attorney leaving a hearing. She was walking into the center of a national conversation that neither Judge Aileen Cannon nor the judicial establishment could control anymore. By the time Crockett reached the courthouse steps, her phone was already buzzing non-stop. Notifications flooded her screen messages from journalists, legal scholars, and political analysts. Major outlets had already cut into their regular programming. Breaking news, the anchor's voice echoed. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett has just presented evidence in court that raises serious procedural questions about one of Judge Aileen Cannon's prior rulings. The clip of her calm, poised exchange with the judge was being replayed on a loop. The line that ignited social media was the one that encapsulated everything. The strength of our justice system isn't found in who it protects, but in how it corrects. Within an hour, that quote was trending on every major platform. Memes, analysis videos, and breakdown threads began to appear, some praising Crockett's courage, others accusing her of grandstanding. But no one could deny what had just happened. A sitting judge had been confronted on the record with proof of procedural inconsistency and had to acknowledge it publicly. Morning shows the next day were a whirlwind of coverage. On Morning Joe, a constitutional law professor called Crockett's motion a brilliant example of strategic advocacy. Crockett didn't accuse, she demonstrated. That's what makes her approach so effective. She stayed within the boundaries of professionalism while dismantling the comfort zone of authority. Meanwhile, conservative commentators scrambled to reframe the narrative. Some dismissed the moment as political theater. Others tried to argue that the emails Crockett introduced were taken out of context. But even among skeptics, the tone was shifting. The mere existence of those communications forced legal experts to revisit how internal clerical correspondence was handled in sensitive cases. Judge Cannon's defenders pointed out that no law had been broken, but her critics countered, legality wasn't the point. Integrity was. Within the legal community, whispers grew louder. Judges, clerks, and attorneys began discussing what Crockett had exposed, the subtle, often unseen interactions that could tilt perception in high-profile cases. A retired federal judge told the Washington Post, Crockett's move wasn't an attack on the judiciary, it was a defense of it. She reminded everyone that oversight isn't disrespect, it's duty. Law schools began dissecting her performance as a case study in modern courtroom advocacy, how to challenge authority without crossing into contempt, how to turn meticulous research into undeniable argument. The public's reaction was electric. On social media, supporters flooded Crockett's pages with messages of gratitude and admiration. Hashtags like Crockett Crushes, Cannon Bold, Justice and Truth in court trended for 2 days straight. One viral post read, "You can't silence someone who brings receipts." Jasmine Crockett didn't argue louder, she argued smarter. At rallies and university panels, activists quoted her words as inspiration for transparency in government and judicial processes. Of course, opposition came swiftly too. Some accused her of using her congressional status to intimidate the court. Others tried to paint her as disrespectful or grandstanding for cameras. But even her critics couldn't ignore the precision of her argument. There were no theatrics, no outbursts, just facts, clean, clear, and inescapable, and that's what unsettled them the most. 2 days later, the Southern District's Public Affairs Office released an official statement. Judge Cannon remains committed to the fair and impartial administration of justice. Any administrative oversight identified will be addressed under existing procedural guidelines. It was a carefully worded response, neutral, distant, but undeniably reactive. Reporters noted the language shift. Normally, such statements would flatly deny any irregularities. This one didn't. It acknowledged that Crockett's submission warranted review. That single-word review became the headline everywhere. Sources close to the courthouse began leaking quiet confirmations that an internal audit had indeed begun. Clerical staff were being interviewed, and communication logs were being re-examined. It wasn't about guilt, it was about process. But for a sitting judge to have her courtroom procedures scrutinized so openly was rare, almost unheard of. And though the review was administrative, the symbolism was seismic. Crockett's motion had done more than challenge a single case. It had reignited public discussion about judicial transparency in politically charged cases. When Crockett finally broke her silence, it wasn't through a press conference. It was through a short, direct statement on her official channels. The law doesn't bend for convenience. It's meant to hold steady even when powerful people lean against it. My duty was simple: to make sure that standard didn't slip. The message was short, but it landed with the force of conviction. Every major outlet quoted it. Later that night she appeared on the Rachel Maddow show, where she elaborated, "This wasn't about embarrassing anyone. It was about ensuring that every person who steps into a courtroom, whether they're famous or forgotten, has a fair and equal hearing. If the system is strong, it should welcome that level of scrutiny." Maddow leaned in. "And did you expect Judge Cannon's reaction?" Crockett smiled slightly. "I expected her to do what judges are trained to do, to uphold the law. I just made sure the record reminded her of that." By week's end, public opinion had evolved. Even critics who once dismissed Crockett's actions as showmanship began acknowledging that she had handled the confrontation with respect and evidence. Legal commentators began describing her as the embodiment of lawful rebellion, someone who challenges power through procedure, not passion. And within Congress, murmurs grew about drafting new legislation to improve transparency between judicial staff and attorneys in ongoing cases. Her impact was already stretching far beyond that single courtroom. Behind the headlines, a subtle transformation was taking place. Judges across the country began quietly re-examining their own clerical correspondence policies. Internal memos circulated about best practices for communication and documentation. Crockett hadn't just won an argument, she'd sparked reform, and Judge Cannon, she remained on the bench, but her rulings now drew closer scrutiny. Every motion, every procedural order was dissected by legal analysts for signs of bias or deviation. The equilibrium of authority had shifted, not in defiance, but in discipline. Crockett's courtroom stand had redefined what accountability could look like in a democracy. She had proven that standing firm didn't require shouting, it required showing. Her calm, dismantling of procedural opacity became a lesson across civic circles that one well-prepared person could stop an entire institution in its tracks, not through force, but through fact. And perhaps that's why the story refused to fade. Because deep down, people weren't just watching a political showdown. They were watching the system test itself and correct itself in real time. The dust began to settle, but the echo of that day still hung in the air. What Jasmine Crockett had done in that courtroom wasn't just about one case. It was about the strength of truth itself. Now came the real question: what did this moment mean? Beyond the courtroom. What happened in that courtroom? Whether you view it as a legal masterstroke, a political moment, or both, doesn't end with a single exchanged line or a paused gavel. It echoes. It matters because it points to something deeper about how power is exercised, how institutions stay honest, and how ordinary people can insist on truth without theatrics. At the surface, the scene looked dramatic. A judge known for control, a challenger who produced a file that forced a pause. But the reason it landed so hard was subtler. It showed that the mechanics of accountability are still available to anyone who does the work. You don't have to be the loudest person in the room to change the outcome. You simply have to be the one with the facts presented at the right moment with the right restraint. Too often our public life rewards immediate impact, an arresting headline, a viral clip, a soundbite that circulates for 48 hours. But facts have staying power. They don't need to be performative. They only need to be true and verifiable. When Crockett in this narrative produced documentary evidence rather than rhetorical flourish, she converted a spectacle into a forensic moment. The audience could not simply feel a point, they could see it. That shift from impression to record is what turns drama into reform. There's an urgent lesson here for anyone who wants to hold power to account. Preparation is the quiet superpower. It's the long, unglamorous work of reading files, cross-checking timelines, and anticipating the predictable moves of more seasoned players. Confidence can open doors. Preparation keeps them open. In this exchange, preparation allowed a measured surgical intervention rather than an emotional reaction, so the response couldn't be dismissed as theatrics. Democratic institutions survive when the public trusts them. Trust is not guaranteed. It's earned and re-earned through transparent process. The value of the moment wasn't just that a discrepancy was pointed out. It was that the method used to point it out was public, procedural, and evidence-based. That's how skepticism becomes. Reform rather than rumor by moving from suspicion to documentation, from allegation to demonstration. This courtroom scene is a parable for everyday encounters with misinformation and power. You don't need a subpoena to apply the same principles. Do the groundwork. Know the facts before you speak. Keep your tone controlled so the substance isn't lost in the noise. When you must show evidence, make it legible, clear-sourced, and verifiable. Whether you're challenging a misleading claim at work, correcting a viral post, or pushing for transparency in your community, the same approach scales: quiet, readiness, methodical proof, and the courage to insist the record reflect reality. Moments like the one we've described don't protect democracy automatically. They model a way of acting that others must choose to emulate. If the lesson is that evidence matters more than applause, then the responsibility falls to individuals to demand that standard, to reward rigor over rhetoric, to share documentation rather than rumor, and to hold leaders accountable in ways that are replicable and fair. So the climax isn't the pause in the courtroom. It's what happens afterward when people change their expectations about how debates should be carried out, when institutions tighten their procedures, and when more citizens decide to prepare rather than perform. Democracy isn't a spectator sport. It survives only when ordinary people defend the truth. That's the summit of the story, not the silence that followed a single reveal, but the longer arc, a public that expects evidence, a civic culture that prizes preparation, and a justice system that answers when asked to explain itself. When those things line up, even the most daunting displays of power can be checked, not by noise, but by fact. Now that you've watched how one moment in court rippled far beyond its walls, let's talk about you. Because this story isn't just about Judge Aileen Cannon or Jasmine Crockett. It's about how you and I interpret truth, react to misinformation, and decide what kind of country we want to live in. This isn't a distant story that belongs to lawyers or politicians. It's a mirror showing us how power responds when challenged, how facts can feel inconvenient, and how courage under pressure can shift an entire conversation. And here's the hard truth: those same patterns play out every single day in our feeds, our workplaces, and our communities. Have you noticed this too? How many times have you seen someone dominate a conversation? Not because they were right, but because they were louder. How often does misinformation spread faster than correction? How often do people dismiss facts as bias simply because those facts challenge what they want to believe? These aren't abstract problems. They shape elections, policies, and public opinion. They influence whether truth is heard at all. So when someone like Jasmine Crockett steps into a courtroom or a hearing and uses preparation, composure, and evidence to dismantle manipulation, it resonates because it's rare, and it reminds us that truth doesn't survive by accident. It survives because people stand up for it repeatedly. Crockett's courtroom moment symbolizes what every informed citizen is capable of. You don't have to have a law degree to confront dishonesty. You just need to be grounded in truth and willing to speak up when it counts. Think about the moments in your own life when you felt pressure to stay silent. Maybe at work, maybe online, maybe in a discussion where facts were twisted. Those are the moments democracy tests us, not in headlines but in habits. You see, democracy doesn't crumble all at once. It erodes slowly each time people decide that confronting lies isn't worth the effort. And yet, the opposite is also true. Democracy strengthens every time someone calmly presents a fact, refuses to be baited, and demands accountability. Let's be honest, modern media thrives on outrage. The loudest voices get the most attention. That means stories like Crockett's often get reduced to clickbait headlines and saws. TED of deep lessons in preparation, integrity, and truth. But you're here watching because you want more than noise, you want understanding, and that's what sets engaged viewers apart. You want to know not just what happened, but why it matters. That's the shift we need in our civic culture, from consuming reaction to studying reality. Because when you understand how power operates, how misinformation spreads, how narratives are spun, and how real accountability works, you become immune to manipulation. You stop being a spectator and start being a participant. So what can you do? Question loudly, but research quietly. Before sharing, posting, or debating, check sources. Make truth your first step, not your final defense. Reward honesty over charisma. The loudest person in the room isn't always right. Seek those who speak carefully, not those who speak constantly. Engage respectfully. The moment we dehumanize the other side, we stop learning and start fighting shadows. Facts lose their impact when they're weaponized with contempt. Support transparency. Whether it's public hearings, court cases, or local governance, stay informed. Democracy depends on an informed electorate, not a distracted one. When people like you insist on these values, the media eventually follows. Politicians adapt, systems evolve. The arc of truth bends because enough individuals hold it steady. In this polarized moment, it's tempting to believe that truth is subjective, that everyone has their own version of it, but facts aren't partisan. Reality doesn't change based on who's talking. And every time someone like Crockett stands their ground with evidence and calm persistence, they remind us of that. The takeaway isn't about who won the exchange. It's about what kind of society we reward, one that values integrity over impulse, substance over style. So ask yourself this, and maybe even drop your answer in the comments. What does standing up for truth look like in your life? How do you deal with misinformation when you see it? When was the last time you changed your mind because someone showed you evidence instead of emotion? These aren't rhetorical questions. They're the beginning of civic responsibility, the kind that sustains democracy more than any law ever could. The courtroom scene you just heard about wasn't just a clash between two professionals. It was a reminder that the rules of truth apply everywhere. It was a moment where composure outlasted provocation and evidence silenced arrogance. That can be your story too. You don't need a camera or a platform, just a commitment to keep showing up with facts when it's easier to look away. And when enough of us do that, truth stops being a casualty and becomes a force again. As the courtroom doors closed and the echoes of that bold legal exchange began to fade, one truth remained undeniable. Jasmine Crockett didn't just win an argument. She reaffirmed the power of preparation, precision, and courage in the face of authority. Judge Aileen Cannon may have been momentarily stunned, but what really stopped the courtroom cold wasn't just Crockett's evidence. It was her command of truth. That's what real power looks like in an age of noise: calm, informed, unshakable clarity. This story isn't about one legal motion or a single courtroom. It's about the world beyond those walls, a world where every one of us is being tested daily by misinformation, distraction, and manipulation. We saw through this confrontation how truth doesn't shout. It stands. Crockett didn't match volume with volume. She matched falsehood with fact. And that's something every one of us can do, whether it's in our community, our classroom, or our next online debate. Because here's the bottom line. Democracy doesn't depend on who yells the loudest, it depends on who listens the closest. You might think moments like this belong to politicians and public figures, but they don't. They belong to citizens who care enough to stay informed, who refuse to let power go unchecked, and who understand that truth only survives when and people protect it. The courage Crockett showed isn't just a legal skill, it's a civic muscle, one that strengthens every time we demand honesty, ask questions, and refuse to accept half-truths as full answers. Each time you choose to verify a story before sharing it, each time you speak up against a misleading claim, each time you hold someone accountable with facts instead of fury, you become part of the same movement that stopped that courtroom cold. If this moment inspired you, if it made you think, that's what leadership looks like, then don't let it end here. Use this energy. Take it into your own conversations, because the next courtroom might be a school board meeting, a community forum, or even a comment thread online. Here's what you can do, starting today. Stay engaged. Follow credible sources, not echo chambers. Speak up. Even small corrections make a big difference. Support truth tellers. Elevate voices who value integrity over influence. Subscribe and share, not just to this channel, but to the habit of staying informed and keeping others informed. Let's end where we began, with a reminder that truth doesn't defend itself. In the end, democracy doesn't defend itself. That's our job. The question is, will you be ready when your moment comes? Jasmine Crockett was ready. She met power with principle. And now it's your turn to keep that same spirit alive, wherever truth needs a voice.